Greetings. My name is Rob Ament. I'm the Road Ecology Program Manager at the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University. I am presenting on the findings of a pooled fund study. The pooled fund study is a joint effort of 10 U.S. agencies and 2 Canadian agencies. And the focus of Task 1 for this pooled fund is to review and research wildlife vehicle collision reductions and also the ability to maintain habitat connectivity across roads or reduce the barrier effect of roads. And Task 1 is called Cost-Effective Solutions. This particular presentation is on the literature review. That was the very first step of the research team for the pooled fund to first review what is known about various mitigation measures. We have reviewed over 30 different mitigation measures for this lit review. So I'll first provide an overview and the mitigation strategies, then look at one of the major components that was to evaluate the effectiveness of these 30 mitigation measures to reduce crashes with large animals, to look at the effectiveness of animal vehicle collision measures to provide ecological connectivity or reduce the barrier effect of roads. And then we look at both large wildlife, domestic animals, primarily large ones such as livestock, cattle, horses, as well as domestic animals that escape and are considered feral, so wild horses and wild burros. And then lastly, we have a section on small animal collisions and potential mitigation measures. So when we look at the issue, there are 1 to 2 million collisions with large mammals in the US each year. This amounts to over 29,000 human injuries, 200 human fatalities, and it accounts for over 8 billion each year in direct costs due to collisions, damage, repair to vehicles, and human injuries. And then lastly, because of road mortality with wildlife, the survival of 22 threatened and endangered species in the US are uncertain until we better mitigate roads for those species. And those are gaudy numbers I just presented earlier from a national study in the US, but the problem is even much larger. And I just briefly show 3 different studies that show that if we look at the traditional crash data sets that departments of transportation use, it's actually 3 times higher in British Columbia. A Virginia study showed that there are 8.5 times more deer vehicle collisions specifically than are in the law enforcement database of Virginia. And the costs are 6 times higher than estimated. And then also for small wildlife vehicle collisions, when surveys were done on a regular basis, the reported loss of animals is actually 6 times higher. So it is a serious problem all across North America for both large and small animals, as well as the safety of motorists. And so what I'll be reporting out today is the results of the literature review for Task 1. And we had 6 different authors, and we tried to divide the measures into the 3 different strategies. One strategy is to influence driver behavior. We reviewed 15 different measures for that. Another is to try to influence animal behavior or to adjust or change population sizes. This is primarily for deer in suburban areas. And then separate, the last strategy is to separate animals from the road and from traffic. And so combined, that totals 30 different measures that we had to review and look for different published literature, reports, et cetera, as best we could find for the last 20 years. So the first strategy is to influence driver behavior. We know when it comes to texting and driving, or drinking and driving. These are large programs to try to influence driver behavior. So you can imagine challenges to adjust driver behavior to reduce animal vehicle collisions is equally difficult. And I'll next summarize, these are all the different measures that have been attempted to reduce animal vehicle collisions, from public information and education campaigns through a whole series of different things that have been attempted. And as you can see, the first column is the measures. The second is how effective we found in the literature in reducing collisions with large mammals. And then the third column is actually, did it also improve connectivity, habitat connectivity, or reduce the barrier effect of roads? And so very few of the strategies had 50 to 100% effectiveness. In fact, only 2 did when it came to influencing driver behavior. One, roadside animal detection systems. Those are the types of systems that detect animals on or near the road, and then they turn on flashing lights to warn oncoming traffic that there are animals on or near the road. And if properly placed, they can be quite effective, up to 97% reduction in collisions. And then the only other one that's highly effective is seasonal closures. Of course, this is primarily in parks or wildlife management areas where there might be a mass migration during a particular time of the year, where they're able to close the road to protect the animals for a period of time. Otherwise, there are a series of different things like wildlife warning signs, roadway lighting. I'll talk about those in a moment. But as you can see on the third column, very few of the measures that try to influence driver behavior improve habitat connectivity or reduce the barrier effect. Basically only 2 of them. That's one that tries to reduce traffic volume. And of course, the seasonal closures, when you have no traffic, it improves wildlife movement across the road. A couple examples of these measures that try to influence driver behavior are standard signs, the jumping deer, or dynamic message signs, which are signs where the wording on the sign is electronic and can be varied. But they tend not to be very effective. The only ones when it comes to signage that have been found to be somewhat effective, 9 to 50%, are seasonal warning signs. And so in the photo, you can see that's a mobile sign that gets moved into a location in a particular time of year where, in this case, on Highway 390 in Wyoming, there's a high amount of moose kill during the winter when they move in along the Snake River, where this highway runs parallel to it. So when you have seasonal warning signs, you can get up to 50%, but clearly not highly effective, but at least somewhat effective. Similar, managing vegetation, so drivers have more time to react to animals adjacent to or crossing the road, can improve safety and reduce animal vehicle collisions. But again, less than 50% was found in the literature. The other problem is for forest interior species, for example, in the photo on this example, they may not want to go across such a wide opening where all the vegetation is removed. So it could potentially cause a barrier effect to small animals or animals that need hiding cover. Another one that can reduce ABCs up to 50% are speed bumps. It absolutely makes the drivers slow down. You can have a series of them and have them specific to particular problem areas where animals are being hit on the road. And these are primarily not used clearly on major highways, but more on low volume roads or roads in parks or wildlife management areas. And another effective measure is actually nighttime lighting. Usually these are not set up just to reduce animal vehicle collisions. They might be, the lights are put in for other safety purposes, often around intersections between major highways, for example. They have been found to be over 50% effective. And the problem is at night, they can affect nocturnal species And lights can also attract other species. So a mixed bag of ancillary effects. And then the last one that is the most successful of influencing driver behavior are animal detection systems. Again, this is where microwaves or a LiDAR or radar detect the animals moving in the right of way or on the road, and then they flip these lights on that warn the drivers as they approach the area. And if carefully placed and not trying to cover too long of a road section, they can be highly effective, up to 97%. So that same type of technology is now moving to be put on board into smart cars or autonomous vehicle. So they're using LiDAR and infrared and other sensors to identify moving wildlife. It's been primarily developed to detect pedestrians or bicyclists, but it also works clearly for warm-blooded large mammals as well as for humans. So the development is ongoing, and what we found was most of the studies are how well they detect animals, not how well they reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. The second strategy is to influence animal behavior. So if you think it's difficult to influence human behavior, animals are even more difficult, but nonetheless, there are a whole suite of measures that have sought to affect animals around the road, everything from deer whistles and flashing lights and noisemakers to reducing wildlife populations. As you can see in the middle column, there are a lot of white boxes, which means there's very little understanding or studies that have evaluated the effectiveness of these measures. Those that have been studied, primarily the only one that's highly effective is reducing wildlife populations by culling the wildlife. And again, this is usually only done in suburban areas where the purpose is to reduce white-tailed deer populations, and the main purpose isn't necessarily because of animal wildlife vehicle collisions, but nonetheless, it does help reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. The other partially effective ones are repellents and also the culling or relocation or anti-fertility, again, all trying to address reducing the wildlife population or moving it further away from the road. And regardless of the measure to influence animal behavior, none of the ones that were in this report had addressed the barrier effect of the highway or improved habitat connectivity. So this is an example of reflector lights, and you might have seen these along many different highways, and it was a Wyoming study that showed they're only about 32% effective in reducing animal vehicle collisions. Another one is to put repellents. Usually it's a smell of a predator or carnivore, and it's used very locally for specific animals that might be attracted to the road. For example, bighorn sheep are attracted to salt on the road, could be sprayed in that area where they winter to try to keep them away from being caught in collisions with vehicles. And again, it's not highly effective, but there is some reduction in collisions. And of course, wildlife culling has been shown to decrease AVCs quite significantly, but again, it's usually not done primarily for safety purposes of the highway, but to reduce the population for other reasons as well. And then the last strategy is to separate animals from the road. And this is done with fencing primarily. And if you fence a road, it's very effective at reducing animal vehicle collisions. However, you then have reduced connectivity, not only for your target species, the large animals, but also for medium and smaller animals as well. So usually what's encouraged is to fence the road and then provide overpasses and underpasses with the fencing so that the barrier effect is reduced and all animals, large and small, can safely cross the road. And so this is the most proven and used mitigation measure for reducing animal vehicle collisions and improving habitat connectivity. And it's being applied all over the world. It tends to be expensive, relatively more expensive than other measures, but it is absolutely for decades proven to be effective and to work for many different species. You can place underpasses and overpasses. This is in the second line, the second measure, just by themselves. And the problem with that is there's no fencing to direct the animals to the structures. And therefore, the effectiveness depends highly on how well the structure is located and whether animals will cross the road in other locations and not necessarily seek out the structures. So again, it really comes to the most effective measure being underpasses and overpasses with fencing. And that's what's being built all over North America and Canada and the US. And there's even a new program in the recently passed infrastructure bill in the US to fund wildlife crossings. So that is why, because when we've looked at all these measures and all these strategies, it comes down to this is a measure that has been used for 20, 30 years now and has been just proven to be highly effective. And so that's why we use fences to begin with. That's what reduces the collisions, and then the structures help them pass safely across the roads, either over or under the pavement. So in summary, there are many types of reduction techniques with varying degrees of success. There's no silver bullet for a cheap, highly effective method yet, and many of the mitigation measures are species or locale dependent. What we found is there's a lot of white boxes, as I pointed out, in many of these measures. So even though many of the measures have been around for decades, we really don't know how effective they are. And so we need to study the unproven ones a little more to get a better understanding. And then, of course, as new technologies come, particularly the onboard sensor systems for vehicles, we'll have to see how well that helps reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. The thing about the autonomous vehicle technologies is that it will only capture large mammals. So when it comes to small animals, roads will still cause a lot of damage or mortality to those wildlife populations. And so again, wildlife crossings and fencing is the proven method to date. And then two other pieces that we did for the lit review was to look at small animal species. And again, like large animals, a couple highly effective ones are for road closure. Again, this is like, for example, when salamanders have their seasonal migration, you would close the road and it would totally protect them until they move to their breeding ponds. And then road removal, of course, would be highly effective as well. And then measures that separate the animals are also highly effective, at least greater than 50%, on average 65% effective, again, with either just straight fencing or fencing with overpasses and underpasses. So many of the ones that are effective for large animals we found are very effective for small animals. The thing is, the cost of these smaller structures or small tunnels for like amphibians are that they're not nearly as costly as the large crossing structures for large mammals. And here's just some examples, and you'll see many of these even smaller crossing structures have fencing to direct the animals or keep the animals off the road and direct them towards the structures. And then the last piece that we looked at were domestic animals, horses, cattle, and donkeys. And again, what we found were effective for those animals, as well as when those domestic animals become feral. That's what we consider wild horses or wild burros. And some of the same measures that are effective for a large wildlife are also effective for domestic animals. So you'll see things such as roadside animal detection systems, the wildlife reduction of populations. Again, with livestock, you wouldn't reduce the population, but with feral wild horses or burros, sometimes they reduce populations and for other purposes. And again, that improves or reduces animal vehicle collisions. And then lastly, the structures with the fencing are highly effective. So almost all species benefit from fencing with crossing structures to 80 to 100%. So that's why they're used all over the world and will be continued to be used in the future. And with that, I want to just give one example of a research project we weren't able to conduct, but that might be effective and relatively inexpensive. And that is simply putting reflective ear tags on livestock so that there's a reduction. Often livestock are hit at night, and it might be just a $5 cost, $2 to $5 for the ear tags, and you could potentially get a significant reduction in livestock collisions. With that, I will direct you to our website. On the website, we have the LitReview final report. We will have this recorded presentation, and we'll have the PowerPoint that I presented here all on the website at the Pooled Fund Study. So please go there and you'll find this presentation as well as the 8 research projects that are part of the Pooled Fund, and also a manual for best practices and the final report for the entire project. As projects get finished, we'll be placing them on our website. Thank you.